We're standing by a long railroad train. The rifles are in the tethers. The packs are off. It's probably noon, maybe 1 o'clock. Los has taken some food out of his satchel and is chewing intently. There's not much attractive about his face, but we've grown fond of it. He lifted our spirits. As if on cue, we pulled out our food too. Some of us started eating everything. Los wrinkled his nose, but he didn't yell. Oh, come on, cram 8 sets in at once. You won't get anything before next week anyway? We ate half as much as our appetites demanded, but at least we warmed up a little. We had been standing in the cold for 2 hours already, and we were freezing. We walked along the train, joked, stomped our heels to warm up. Those who had paper began to write letters. My fingers were frozen, so I didn't have time to write. Echelons with ammunition were continuously passing through the station. Suddenly the train stopped and stretched for almost a kilometre. What is it? Trains arrived, disembarked, reinforcements, and on the tracks there were others waiting for departure. Here came another train, stood a few minutes and followed in the opposite direction. What a mess. The lane near which we were standing, frozen, it seems, forever. Perhaps it was for the best. Deciding to stretch, I pulled myself up and looked into the train. There were no cattle, of course, but plenty of ammunition. We had been huddled at the station for 4 hours, and we were freezing. As darkness fell, the cold intensified. To pass the time, we went backpacking again. It was almost completely dark. Los, too, was probably fed up with everything. He pulled his hat over his ears, raised his collar and walked back and forth, trying to keep warm. Probably walked about 10 kilometres. Our Kaminians were gathered in a Lenzen, Olensheim and Gals. Germans who spoke French no better than I spoke German. Morvan, an Alsatian. Utabik, an Austrian who looked like an Italian because of his dark curly hair. Later, however, he broke away from our group. And finally, me, half French, half German. The 6 of us somehow found common ground. Utabik, for goodness sake, was humming Italian love songs that were completely inappropriate for the setting. We were used to Wagner, but here we were listening to the Neapolitan weirdo's lamentations about his fate. Gals's watch with its luminous dial showed 9:30. We thought that we would not be left at the station for the night. Not so. Another hour passed, and some of the soldiers, having laid out their sleeping bags, began to settle down for the night, to protect themselves from dampness. Some of them were not afraid to lie down directly on the sleepers, under the wagons. Our field fell perched on a bale of army clothes and smoked. He didn't look his best. I could not imagine that we would be left to our fate, forced to spend the night like this in the open air. It can't be. The departure horn would sound, and those smart people who had already settled down for the night would have to pack their sleeping bags in a hurry. But we had better follow their example. 2 hours passed, and we were still sitting on the cold stone floor. The frost was getting worse. It began to rain. Our field officer arranged his tent. He covered the suitcases with waterproof cloth and so escaped the weather. Old fox. We must find shelter. We can't go far away from the rifles, but we leave them soaking in the rain anyway, expecting a real beating in the morning. The best places are already occupied, of course. The only thing left is to get under the wagons. It would be better to go inside, but the doors are tied with wire. Cursing everything in the world, we settle down for the night. Some kind of shelter, but still a shelter. We are dripping with water. We are mad with anger, but the commanders probably laugh at our petty problems. It was the first time I slept in the open air. What can I say? I could not stay with my eyes closed for more than 15 minutes. A huge axle served as my bed canopy. Sometimes it seemed to me that it was moving, as if a train was moving. I awoke to find that everything was still where it should be. I slipped back into slumber and awoke again. With the first rays of sunshine, we, kneading our stiff cocks, made our way outside. We must have looked like dead men who had just been dug out of the ground. At 8 o'clock in the morning, we formed up and headed for the platform. Gals kept saying that we might as well have spent the night in the barracks. None of us had the slightest idea of the hardships of soldier life. It was the first time we had spent a night in the open air, and how many more such nights, only in worse conditions, awaited us. In the meantime, we were to accompany the train with military equipment. Our company was divided into 3 parts to escort 3 echelons. 3 or even 2 men per platform. Gals and Lenzen had to guard tarpaulin-covered airplane wings with the image of the Black Cross and other parts of military equipment intended for the Luftwaffe. Judging by the markings, The cargo was on its way from Ratisbon to Minsk, in Disk, which means Russia. My mouth was dry. My heart swelled. 20 Soon the whistle blew, and the train moved. After a while the rain stopped, but it started to snow. After thinking, we climbed under the tarpaulin and settled down near the aircraft engine. The wind stopped shaking us. It became warmer at once. Pressed against each other, we almost warmed up. We, of course, talked a lot and from time to time burst into laughter. Though what was there to laugh about? The train was rolling to the east, and we did not know what was going on around us. Only from time to time we heard the rumbling of oncoming trains. Suddenly Lenson heard a scream. He made a sign to us to be silent and cautiously poked his head out from under the tarpaulin. "Lasses," he said calmly. After a moment's silence, he added, "False alarm." A few seconds later, however, someone tore the edge of the tarp. The face of a field officer appeared in front of us. At the sight of our happy faces, he was twisted with rage. Fleeing from the cold, Lace pulled his helmet over his head and pulled on his gloves. The snow covered him from head to toe. "Halt! Attention!" he shouted. But we could not carry out the command with the usual rapidity. The platform was rocking from side to side. What happened next is worthy of the theatre of the absurd. I can still, after all these years, see Gal's clumsy bear. He is trying hard to stand upright, but the train is shaking so much that Gal's is wobbling left and right along with it. My overcoat is caught on some part of the engine and pulls to the floor. Louse isn't on top of his game either. The impression is as if he had too much to drink. Finally, our field officer made a brutal grimace and got down on one knee. We followed suit. From the outside we could have been mistaken for 4 conspirators. But everything was much more prosaic. Feldspiel honoured us with the last words. "What the devil are you doing here?" He raged. "Do you realize who you are and why we're all here?" Gels, who was sick of all the ceremonies, did not think long and interrupted his superiors. "There's no point in standing outside," he said reasonably. "The cold is terrible, and what will you see here?" How angry Laos! It was necessary to see. He grabbed Giles by the collar, shook him like a sack of hay. "At the first stop, I'll file a report," he said. "You'll be in the penalty battalion. You left your post, okay? Did you even think? What if the platform ahead of you blows up? How would you notify the others?" "By sitting under a tarp." "Why?" Linson asked. "The platform ahead of us is about to blow up." Shut up, you idiot. There are saboteurs everywhere. The Russians are ready for anything. Guerrillas are derailing whole trains, throwing grenades, Molotov cocktails. That's why you're here, we stop it. You put on your helmets and go, or I'll throw you out. He didn't have to repeat the order. Though the cold was getting to our bones, we set up in the places Lace had assigned. It clung to the ledge and jumped to the next platform. He always carried out his tasks with precision. Although I had never had a heart-to-heart talk with him, I suspected that he was not a bad man. All the other non-commissioned officers were not so strict. They said they were saving themselves for the real work. However, at the right moment from Laels was useful as much, if not more, than from others. He was the oldest of the field officers. Maybe he'd been to the front lines, even smelled gunpowder. In short, in my opinion, he couldn't be called irresponsible. Anyway, he didn't give us a hard time. If we are not able to bear the cold and other hardships, we can't survive at the front. To die at the hands of some saboteur without having seen a real war is foolish. Suddenly I saw a man ahead of me. He was running on the next track. I was probably not the only one who noticed him, but none of the soldiers sitting on the front platforms even moved. I grabbed my rifle and took aim at the saboteur. And who was it if not a saboteur? The echelon was moving slowly. I couldn't find a better target. In a few minutes our platform equaled the running man. There was nothing special about his appearance. Maybe it was just a lumberjack looking at the train. After all, we were still in Poland. I felt like a fool. I was ready to shoot, and there was no enemy. Just some Polak rascal. I took aim, intending to shoot over his head, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out. The Pole ran for his life. And I thought, that's how the Reich got a bigger enemy. The echelon went on at the same speed. A little while later, Laos appeared. Frost is frost, but we must continue the detour. He gave me a surprised look. 2 of us were on watch at the fighting post, and the third was warming himself under a tarpaulin. We had been on the road for 8 hours and were freezing cold. We had to think about what would happen at night, and it was getting quite lousy. I ducked under the tarpaulin, and for 20 minutes I had a tooth on a tooth. We were approaching Minsk. The forest was getting darker. A quarter of an hour ago, the train began to pick up speed. The fierce wind promised death from cold. To keep warm, we ate almost half of our rations. Suddenly the train began to slow down. Brakes squeaked, clutches rattled. Now we're barely moving. The first platforms turned right. We were transferred to the second track. For another 5 minutes, the train keeps moving and finally stops. 2 officers jumped off one of the front platforms and went to the end of the train. They are met by Lowe's and 2 other sergeants. They confer about something, but they don't tell us anything. The soldiers stuck their heads out and looked around. There was no better place for terrorists than the woods. The train had been standing for a few minutes, and then there was a clatter of wheels in the distance. We got down and were walking back and forth to keep warm when a whistle sounded, calling us to return to the cars. On the track from which our train had just left showed a locomotive shrouded in a cloud of smoke. What I saw horrified me. I wish I were a brilliant writer to describe the sight before us in all its colours. First came a car filled with railroad equipment. It was ahead of the locomotive and obscured the already dim light of the headlights. Then came the coupled locomotive, followed by a wagon with a hole in its roof, apparently a field kitchen. Smoke was coming from its short chimney. Here is another car with high handrails. In it, German soldiers armed to the teeth are riding. The rest of the train, open platforms like the one we were on, carried a different kind of cargo. At first I could not even make out what it was. And only after a few moments I realized that the wagon was full of human bodies, with living people sitting or standing curled up behind them. The most knowledgeable of us explained briefly Russian prisoners of war. It seemed to me that I had seen exactly such brown overcoats in the castle before, but I was not quite sure. Gales looked at me. His face was deathly pale, with only red spots showing in places from the cold. "Did you see that?" he whispered. They'd put up dead men to protect themselves from the frost. I couldn't say a word in horror. There were corpses in every wagon, pale faces, legs stiff with frost and death. I stood there, unable to take my eyes off the disgusting sight. The 10th carriage was passing us when something even more horrible happened. 4 or 5 bodies rolled off the platform and fell away from the tracks. The funeral train did not stop. A group of officers and sergeants from our train went to see what had happened. I, driven by some strange curiosity, jumped off the car and walked up to the officers, saluted and asked in a trembling voice if the men were dead. The officer gave me a surprised look. After all, I had no right to leave my post. He must have noticed my embarrassment, for he made no comment. "I think so," he said sadly. "Help the comrades bury them." With these words he turned and left. Gales came with me. We went back to the wagons to get shovels and started digging a hole not far from the embankment. Leighton, another guy, went through the dead men's clothes, trying to find documents by which to identify them. I found out later that the poor guys didn't have any civilian papers. It took Gales and me a fist of willpower not to look at the corpses as we dragged them to the pit. We were filling them with earth when the departure signal sounded. It was getting colder by the minute. I was overwhelmed with a feeling of disgust. An hour later, our train passed buildings that had been destroyed, as we noticed despite the poor lighting. Another train passed, which did not make such a gloomy impression on us, but its sight did not make us feel any better. The carriages were marked with red crosses. On stretchers, which were visible through the windows, lay, most likely, the seriously wounded. From other windows, bandaged soldiers waved to us in a friendly manner. Finally, we arrived at the train station in Minsk. The train stopped all along the long, wide platform, along which were scurrying busy soldiers and Russian prisoners of war, led by other prisoners with white armbands on their sleeves. These were Russian defectors. They had volunteered to guard their comrades, which suited our authorities just fine. Who else could make Russian prisoners work all day long? Orders were given first in German, then in Russian. A crowd approached our train. By the light of trucks pulled up to the platform, unloading began. We also took part in the work, which took nearly 2 hours. We warmed up a little, and then busied ourselves again with our food supplies. Gales, who did not suffer from lack of appetite, had consumed more than half of his rations for the fortnight. We spent the night even with the comforts of some building. The next day we were sent to the hospital, where we were kept for 2 days and given several inoculations. Minsk was subjected to heavy destruction. the cities suffered from shelling. It was impossible to walk along some streets at all. There were so many pits formed after the bombing. Many of them were sometimes as deep as 15 feet. To somehow get over the obstacles, boards were thrown across the trenches. Once we gave way to a Russian woman laden with groceries, followed by 4 or 5 children who looked at us with surprised round eyes. We came across several unusual stores, in which instead of broken windows, boards or sacks of straw were inserted. Lenson, Morvan, and I looked into some of them for curiosity's sake. On the shelves were clay jars painted in different colours with drinks, plants, dried vegetables or thick syrup. We didn't know how to say hello in Russian, so we spoke only among ourselves. The Russians in the shops looked at us with mixed fear and smiles. The shopkeeper would approach us with a tortured smile, offering to take his groceries, hoping in this way to propitiate the ruthless warriors he imagined us to be. We scooped up spoonfuls of syrup with a yellowish flour, quite pleasant to the taste, a little reminiscent of honey. The only thing I didn't like was too much fat. As I do now, the faces of the Russians stand before me, handing us their syrup. They smile while saying the word oruka. I never found out what it meant. An invitation to taste the food, or that was the name of the mixture. We all these days, which however did not prevent us from showing up on time for lunch, which began at 11 o'clock. Gels took everything. The Russians offered him with exceptional politeness. This sometimes even irritated me. He put in his wok all the products of the Soviet traders, differing from each other only in consistency. Sometimes he mixed in his wok the notorious oruka, boiled wheat, herring cut into pieces, and other products. Whatever was mixed in, Gals devoured it all, resembling an insatiable hog. However, there was no time for rest. Minsk was an important centre of army supplies. It was necessary to send the goods to their destination and unpack the incoming ones. The life of the military unit of this sector was surprisingly well organised. Mail was coming in. Soldiers on leave were shown movies. We weren't allowed to see them, though. There were also libraries and restaurants, staffed by Russians serving German soldiers. It was too expensive for me to visit a restaurant, and I did not go to them, but Gales, ready to sacrifice anything to fill his stomach, spent all his money here and a good part of ours. In exchange, he described in detail the entire menu of the place, not forgetting to lie a little. His stories made us drool. We were fed much better than in Poland, and we were able to add to our diet the products we bought with our own money at no extra cost. And this was necessary. At the beginning of December, the terrible frosts began. The temperature dropped to 5 degrees below zero. The snow, which fell in huge quantities, did not melt. In some places there were drifts up to 3 feet high. In such conditions, the delivery of food to the front was slowed down. And as the soldiers who returned from the front line, where it was even colder than in Minsk, said, they had to share their meagre rations among themselves. Lack of food and frost led to diseases, mainly pneumonia and frostbite. At this time, the Reich made every effort to protect the soldiers from the Russian winter. In Minsk, Kovno and Kiev were brought in huge quantities of blankets. Winter clothes made of sheepskin, thick-toed overshoes with woolen tops, gloves, hoods, and portable heaters that worked equally well with gasoline, oil, and alcohol. Food sealed in special boxes, and thousands of other necessary things. Our task, the Rollban convoy troops, was to get all of this to the front lines where the cargo awaited the advancing troops. We made superhuman efforts, but not always in time. No words can describe our sufferings, not from the soldiers of the Russian army, but from the frost. The roads outside of the major cities could not be repaired. Even less could we build new ones. While we were doing gymnastics in the fall, the Wehrmacht, having conducted a brilliant offensive, got stuck in an incredible quagmire with all the supplies. The cold weather came and froze the disgusting ruts leading to the east. These roads could only be travelled in carts, and yet it became possible to transport troops. But winter came, tons of snow fell on vast areas of Russia, and traffic was again paralysed. In December 1942, we were escorting cargoes. We shoveled the snow so that our wagons could move 15 or 20 miles, but the next day everything was covered with snow again, and we had to start again. There were bumps and gullies under the snow, on which we constantly stumbled, and by evening we had to find a roof over our heads. Sometimes our engineers built a shelter for the night. Sometimes we slept in a hut or any other house we could find. In a room intended for one family with 2 children, there were 50 of us. Especially valued were specially invented tents, made of dense waterproof fabric for Russian weather conditions. They were designed for 9 people. There was plenty of food, and at least in this our existence was more or less bearable. We rarely bathed. Insects began to breed. Therefore, the first thing we did when we returned to Minsk was to disinfect ourselves. I was tired of sacred Russia and travelling in wagons. I, like everyone else, was afraid of getting under fire, but at the same time it was time for me to shoot with my Mauser, which was always hanging around with me unnecessarily. It seemed that shooting would be my revenge for the torment of the frost and the blisters that covered my hands from the continuous shoveling of snow. My leather gloves were torn and my icy fingers were peeking out, so the cold sensation in my hands and feet was so intense that the cold seemed to pierce my heart. The temperature did not rise above -5 degrees. We were stationed 15 miles north of Minsk to guard a huge garage of military vehicles. There were 8 huts in the village. We occupied 7. Only in one, the largest, lived a family of Russians. Father, mother, and 2 daughters Horsky. They said they had come here from the Crimea. They remembered their native land with nostalgia. The Korskys kept an inn. In it we ate meat with our own money and killed time with fellow travellers. Shingat snow had ceased, but the frost was getting worse. One evening I went on guard duty for 2 hours. I crossed the parking lot where there were parked 500 cars or even more, half covered with snow. All day long I've been dreading the thought of walking around in the dark. While we are walking here, the guerrillas could sneak in between the cars and shoot us all. What's easier? True, I had already convinced myself that the war, if it was going on, was happening somewhere else, not here. I had not yet met any Russians, except traders and prisoners. Having convinced myself, I went to my post, which was about 15 yards from the first vehicles. The way was through a trench dug for the purpose of allowing us to reach the vehicles, or, on the contrary, to move away unnoticed. It snowed, and the edges of the trench rose nearly 3 feet more. After each snowfall, we had to dig the trench anew. To get a glimpse of something, I stood on a crate. I had thrown a blanket over my overcoat and could hardly move my arms. I refused a portion of alcohol. It made me feel even worse. I began to tune myself to resist the terrible frost. The night sky was clear. I had a 100-yard view. I could see stunted shrubbery on the horizon. The telephone wires diverged in different directions. The poles to which they were attached were not firmly anchored in the ground, and from the weight of the snow they often toppled over. I stuck it out from under the blanket. The hat is overhanging. It covers my forehead and even my cheeks. A helmet on top. It is supposed to be worn during guard duty. The raised collar of the pullover my parents sent me reaches the brim of the cap from behind. From time to time I look at the equipment I am guarding. It's hard to imagine what would happen if we had to get out of here right away. The engines must be frozen solid. I had been at my post for a good hour when a figure appeared at the far end of the parking lot. I scrambled into the trench. Before I took my hands out of my pockets, I dared to peer out once more and look. The figure was heading in my direction. It might be a divorcee. What if it was a Bolshevik? Grunting with exertion, I pulled my hands out of my warm pockets and grasped my rifle. The trigger was frozen to my finger. I drew my weapon and shot. Who's coming? Password? The correct answer came, and I lowered the barrel. But I had taken precautions for a reason. It was an officer making his rounds. Everything all right? Yes, Lieutenant. Well, Merry Christmas. Oh, is it Christmas already? Sure it is. Look. She pointed to the Horsky house. The snow-covered hut seemed to sink into the ground, but the narrow windows shone brighter than the blackout rules allowed. And in the windows I could see the silhouettes of my companions. A few seconds passed, and from a bundle of firewood, probably soaked in gasoline, a flame appeared. 300 voices, as one, yelled in the silence of the frosty night a song. Oh, why not? Oh, still not. Could such a thing be possible? At that moment everything else, everything outside the camp, lost its meaning for me. I could not take my eyes off the burning windows. The faces of some of my comrades were illuminated by the fire. The faces of others could not be seen. And the song continued, now with several voices. I do not know if it was the silence of the night that moved me, but I had never experienced anything better in my life. For the first time since I became a soldier, I was reminded of my youth. What is at home now? What's going on in France? We knew from the bulletins that many Frenchmen are now on our side. That's wonderful. It's good that the French and Germans are fighting side by side. Soon we won't be suffering from the cold. The war will be over, and we'll be home to talk about our exploits. This Christmas, I did not receive any gift that I could touch, but I learned about the union between my two native countries, and that was enough. I knew that I was a man now, and I pushed away the thought of how nice it would be to receive a wind-up toy as a present. My comrades sang, and probably there were thousands like them all over the front. I didn't know then that it was at that time that Soviet T-34 tanks, taking advantage of the fact that our offensive had stopped because of Christmas, crushed the 6th Army posts near Armatovsk. At that time I could not have imagined that thousands of my comrades in the 6th Army had fallen in the hell of Stalingrad. How could I have known that German cities were subjected to devastating raids by the British Royal Air Force and the US Air Force? It could not have occurred to me that the French would betray the Franco-German Entente. In its own way, it was the most beautiful Christmas of my life. I thought of nothing and wanted to know nothing. I was alone under a huge sky with stars shining on it. I remember a tear running down my frozen cheek, not from grief or joy, but from some other strange feeling. When I got back to the apartment, the celebration was over. The fire had been put out. Gals had saved half a bottle of schnapps for me. Not to offend him, I took a few sips. 4 more days passed. The frost was still fierce, and there were heavy snowfalls. We went outside only on duty, which was kept to a minimum. We burned several tons of wood. The houses kept warm, so that sometimes we even sweated from the heat. We were feeling pretty good. And, as always happens, that's when the trouble started. Early in the morning, at 3 o'clock, the guard opened the door of the hut with a kick of his foot, letting in a whirlwind of cold air and 2 soldiers, who seemed to be twins, as their faces were blue with frost. They walked to the stove, and only after a few minutes did they speak. I, like everyone else, shouted at them to close the door. The reply was cursing and an order to get up. We, grunting and not too fast, began to rise. The soldier who had given the order kicked a bench that stood nearby and yelled the order again, grabbed one of our comrades, covered with blankets, overcoat and uniform, and threw him out of the improvised bed. In the dim light from the stove, we discerned the epaulettes of a field fill. "You pigs, are you going to get up?" he shouted, pulling out a bed everyone he could reach. "Who is responsible for this herd? What a disgrace. Is this how you hope to stop the Russian advance? If you're not ready in 10 minutes, I'll throw you out like that." Unable to comprehend the sudden awakening, we hurriedly packed our belongings. Without closing the door, the field felon ran out of the hut like a madman and rushed into another, sowing panic everywhere. We could not understand what was happening. Our sentry, who had hardly regained consciousness, reported that the strangers had come from Minsk by hitchhiker. 15 miles on a snow-covered road is not an easy thing to do. That explains their excited state. But no matter how fierce the fierce field felon yelled, he could not get us in line in less than 20 minutes. Los, sleeping as soundly as the others, tried to rouse us, pretending to be as angry as his colleague. The field febel, whose anger had not subsided, shouted orders. "Even before dawn, you must go to the unit of Commandant Ultraner in Minsk." He turned to Lace. "Take 15 cars from the depot and go." "I don't understand. Couldn't you have called? Why create unnecessary problems for yourself?" Later we learned that during our peaceful sleep the telephone wire had been cut in 4 places. It's impossible to imagine how much effort we expended to start the trucks and get them out of the depot. We hauled whole barrels of gasoline to fill the gas tanks and alcohol to pour into the radiators, and falling over with fatigue, shoveled cubic yards of snow, and all this in almost total darkness. On the broken snow-covered road by which the field officer had reached us, we set off. One truck drove off into a ditch, and we tried to get it for half an hour. It only slid on the snow and almost drove into the hole. In the end, we all had to save the damn truck. We literally carried it out on our hands. At 8 o'clock in the morning, before dawn, we arrived at the Ultran unit. We lined up, shivering from the cold, on a huge city square, where besides us there were already 200 or 300 soldiers. Life was boiling in Minsk. From loudspeakers located on the square, the speech of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief was heard. He reported that even a victorious army cannot avoid losses and deaths of soldiers. Our role as convoy troops is to deliver, despite any hardships of which the command is well aware, food, ammunition, and everything else that is required by the troops on the offensive. At any price we must break through to the banks of the Volga. Only so General von Paulus will be able to continue the victorious battle. From the destination we are separated by 1,000 miles, so we cannot lose a minute. After lunch we set off. I found myself alone on a 5.5-ton DKK loaded with heavy automatic weapons. The road leading out of town was perfectly tamped, so we travelled at high speed. There must have been a road crew working here around the snow on both sides of the river was up to 12 feet. We passed through a post with many signs. We turned at an arrow to Pripyat, Kiev, Dnipro, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk. Everyone who was able to hold a shovel was hired for road work, which is why we travelled 100 miles in a short time and climbed to the top of a hill overlooking the vast expanse. The 10 or 12 trucks ahead of us slowed down. Up ahead, a squad of soldiers was clearing snow. A powerful truck was pushing a sled, equipped with some sort of fan that threw snow in all directions, and in front lay its huge masses almost a metre high. Our commander and his subordinate officers ventured to make a reconnaissance in that direction, where the snow had not yet been cleared. Immersed up to their knees, they surveyed the horizon and wondered how to get through these impassable forests. Our car was warm, all the windows were closed and the engine was running. We were ordered to get out of the trucks and take shovels. They were not enough for everyone, and the officers ordered to work with boards, helmets, even trays. A few soldiers and I decided to tear off the back door of the truck and use it as a plough to shovel the snow. Our futile attempts were interrupted by a field sergeant's whistle. "What are you hoping for? Come with me. Let's go look for labourers. Bring your weapons." Such a turn of events pleased me. I'd rather go with a field sergeant than shovelling snow. It's not clear where he was going to get workers. Leaving Minsk, we passed only 2 deserted villages. We took our rifles and walked away from the tracks made by the wheels of the trucks, sinking more and more into the snow with each step. For the first 10 minutes I struggled to keep up with the field Fabel, who walked ahead at a distance of 5 meters from me. I began to pant, sweat trickled down my back under the heavy layers of clothing. Vapor was coming out of my mouth, which immediately disappeared into the cold air. I did not take my eyes off the deep footprints that the field felon left, trying to keep up with him, but, as he was bigger than I was every time I stepped into the snow, I was even afraid to look at the horizon. It seemed so far away. Soon the birches hid the convoy from our sight. Our small, ridiculous detachment fearlessly rushed into the boundless desert of snow. This went on for about an hour. Suddenly, in complete silence, we heard a sound growing louder and louder and stopped. The field fell. Now it's getting close. It is a pity to miss such an opportunity. What he meant I never understood, but soon I heard a rumbling sound. On my left I saw a black streak cutting through the snow. A train. We had reached the railroad track. But what would that do for us? We're not going to pile trucks on top of railroad cars, are we? The train was moving slowly about half a kilometre away from us. It was a very long train, black cars, interspersed with occasional locomotives with smoke coming from their chimneys, which immediately disappeared as if by magic. The train must have been equipped with a special snowplough. "There are a lot of freight trains here," said the field officer. "Most of them are loaded with ammunition, but there are also passengers. Let's stop one and take Russian workers." At last I understood. Now all that was left was to wait. We walked around endlessly, trying to keep warm. True, the temperature seemed to have risen slightly, maybe up to 15 degrees. While we waited for the train, the cold seemed intolerable. The soldiers who were shoveling snow by the trucks were in a better position. Sweat was pouring off them. I never once saw anyone endure torment better than the Germans, whether it was frost, heat, or anything else. I, on the other hand, during my stay in Russia, did nothing but escape the cold without end. The first train didn't even stop. Feldfebel outdid himself trying to stop the train. He was out of his mind with anger. The soldiers shouted to us from the train that they had received orders not to stop under any circumstances. Annoyed, we continued to move in the direction of the train that had passed. In any case, it was certain that the track ran parallel to the highway. To get back to our comrades, we only had to turn at right angles. The only bad thing was that we had torn ourselves away from the kitchen. The time for lunch had already passed. I had 2 pieces of rye bread in my overcoat pocket, but I was in no hurry to get them out. Soon we realized that the railroad passed by the place where the convoy was, and we went back. Senior soldiers with whom I was shoveling snow had already gotten to know each other. They had not stopped talking since we had moved away from the convoy. Now the field felder was already at the head of the whole troop, and I was trying to keep up with him. On both sides of the railroad were surrounded by scrawny shrubbery, stretching forward for several kilometres. Gradually the shrubbery became more and more dense and moved farther away from the tracks. Any irregularity in the landscape was clearly distinguished among the vast expanse of snow. For several minutes I had not taken my eyes off the black spot 500 yards away. 10 minutes later we realized it was a hut. The Feldfell headed toward it. Apparently it was a railroad worker's house. Feldfell raised his voice. Hurry up. We'll wait here. We regrouped. A young freckled fellow, one of those who had been shoveling snow with me, was saying something witty to his buddy. We were approaching the hut when a sharp pop cut through the air. A cloud of smoke appeared from the right side of the hut. I could not recover from my astonishment and looked fearfully around at my comrades. The field felder was sprawled on the ground like a goalkeeper who catches a ball and loaded his rifle. The freckled fellow staggered toward me. His eyes were wide open, with a stupid, bewildered expression in them. 6 paces away, he fell to his knees, opened his mouth as if he were going to shriek, but said nothing, and toppled over onto his back. There was a second click, and the distinctive whistle of a bullet. Without a second's hesitation, I threw myself on the snow. The field officer fired, and a clump of snow flew off the roof. I could not take my eyes off the young soldier with freckles, whose motionless body lay almost beside me. Cover me, you idiots, growled the field officer, jumping up and rushing forward. I looked at the dead soldier's body. He seemed more surprised than frightened. We aimed our rifles at the hut, from which shots still rang out, and opened fire. The sound of the Mauser added to my confidence. 2 more bullets whistled in my ears. The sergeant, with a nonchalant look, straightened to his full height and threw a grenade. The air was torn by the sound of the explosion. A gap had been created in the hut. With a coolness that I myself could not understand, I continued to watch the hut. The Feldfebel was still firing. I loaded my rifle and was about to fire when 2 figures emerged from the ruins of the hut and ran toward the woods. The opportunity couldn't have been better. The black target was perfectly visible in the snow. I pulled the trigger, and the field felder also fired in the direction of the fleeing men, but, like me, did not hit. A little while later he ordered us up, and we climbed out of our trenches. In the ruins of the hut we saw a man leaning against the wall. His face, half overgrown with a thick beard, was turned toward us. His eyes were gloomy. He looked at us without saying a word. He was not wearing a military uniform, but civilian clothes. His left hand, covered with blood, caught my eye. Pity stirred in my soul. The voice of the field fable brought me back to reality. Partisan, he shouted. You say no. You know what awaits you? He pointed his gun at the Russian. He cowered fearfully in a corner. The Feldfebel holstered his gun. Nurse, take care of him, he ordered, waving in the direction of the wounded man. We carried the partisan out into the air. He groaned and said something unintelligible. We heard the clatter of the wheels of an approaching train. But this time the train was returning to the rear. We managed to stop it. 2 soldiers and a lieutenant jumped off the first car. We put on our visors. "No, for God's sake, who are you?" he shouted. "Why did you stop us?" Feldfebel explained that we were looking for labourers. "Only the wounded and dying are on the train," said the lieutenant. "If we had demobilised soldiers, I would help you. But as it is, what can I do for you?" "We have 2 wounded," said the Feldfebel. The lieutenant had already gone to the freckled soldier, who lay motionless where the shot had hit him. "You can see he's dead." "No, Mr. Lieutenant. He's still breathing." "Yes. Well, maybe. He'll live another 15 minutes. All right, we'll take him." He beckoned to 2 soldiers with stretchers, and they lifted our comrade. There was blood on the green of his overcoat. "And the other?" the lieutenant asked impatiently. From there, from the hut." The lieutenant cast a glance at the bearded man, who apparently had not long to live either. "Wei-ho-dee." "A Russian, a partisan." "That's it. You probably think I'm going to deal with these pigs, ready to shoot you in the back as soon as you turn your back. As if there weren't enough wounded at the front." He gave orders to his soldiers. They approached the poor man lying in the snow. 2 shots were fired. Soon we set off back to the highway. The field fate bell had demurred in bringing in additional labour. We were returning to our convoy, which, it may be doubted, had hardly succeeded in clearing the snow. It was the first time I had come under fire. The feelings that seized me are difficult to describe. The events of the day seemed absurd. The huge footsteps of the field fleet in the snow. The young, freckled soldier who was supposed to be returning with us. Everything happened so quickly that I did not even have time to grasp the significance of all these events, and yet 2 died senseless deaths. One of them was not even 18 years old. It was long after dark when we reached the convoy. It was a cold and clear night. The temperature was dropping at an alarming rate. We could hardly keep on our feet from cold and hunger. My head was foggy. The vapour from my breath froze on my collar, which was raised almost to my eyes. There soon we saw the soldiers of the convoy. Their black figures loomed clearly against the white background. Indeed, they were not very successful. The trucks were buried up to their wheels in snow. Ice had frozen to the tyres and bumpers. Everyone took shelter in the cabs, throwing on whatever they could find, and tried to sleep, despite the cold. Nearby, 2 sentries stomped about, trying to warm their stiff legs. And the lights of cigarettes and pipes shone through the frosted windows of the cabs. Climbing into my truck, I fumbled in the darkness for my satchel and pulled out a kettle. Clutching it in my stiffened fingers, I put in a few spoonfuls of some mixture that tasted like frozen soybeans. It was completely impossible to eat. I rummaged through the satchel and luckily found something edible. When I heard some voices outside, I poked my head out the door. There was a fire burning in a hole in the snow. I jumped out of the truck and ran as fast as I could toward this source of light, warmth, and joy. There were 3 men standing in front of the fire, including the field officer with whom we had travelled today. He was breaking kindling over his knee. "Oh, I've had enough of this frost. I had pneumonia last winter. If I get sick again, I'm finished. Anyway, you can see our trucks for 2 miles, so it won't do any harm to have a little fire." "You're right," replied the other soldier. He was at least 45 years old. "The Russians, partisans and non-partisans, are sleeping peacefully." "I wouldn't mind a warm bed either," said his buddy, staring at the fire. Everyone came to the fire except the field febble, who was breaking a box into planks. Suddenly there was a shock. "Hey, you there!" Someone was approaching us, making his way among the trucks. A silver badge gleamed on his cap. A field officer and an elderly soldier started to put out the fire. We stretched out in front of the captain. "Are you crazy? Didn't you hear the order, since you had no trouble lighting the fire? Take your weapons and patrol the neighbourhood. Your carnival must have gotten a few guests by now. You'll be on duty in pairs until the departure. Is that clear?" That was the last straw of my patience. I was dying of hunger, cold, exhaustion, and God knows what else. It was the last thing I needed was to wander all night in knee-deep snow. I was angry, but I couldn't even express it. Filthy Bill decided that the 50-year-old soldier and I would be the first to patrol. "We'll relieve you in 2 hours. You'll be better off." Why we would be better off, I did not understand. I knew only one thing. The bastard had put me with the old man on purpose. Of course, he'd be better matched with the others, the 25-year-olds, the powerful ones. Why would he want a frail 17-year-old teenager or an old man? I set off with my mate in misfortune. It was hard to imagine a more vulnerable pair. Before I had walked a few steps, I fell into the snow. As I tried to get up, I felt tears rolling down my face. The old man was not such a bad man. He must have had enough of this too. "Are you all right?" he asked in a fatherly tone. Fuck you," I said in reply. He said nothing. He pulled up his collar and let me go on ahead. I didn't even know where we were supposed to go, but so what? What I knew for sure was that I would go twice as fast as the dark mass of the convoy out of sight. And so I did, and despite my fatigue, I pulled away from the old man, trying to breathe in as little of the cold air as possible. Walking a little further, I made sure I couldn't go any further. My knees were shaking. I stopped and cried. A picture of France, of my family, of the games I played with my friends came into my mind. What did I want here? I remember saying, sobbing, "I'm too young to be a soldier." I don't know if my companion was surprised by my lamentations. As he approached me, he said, "You're walking too fast, young man. I'm sorry, but I can't keep up with you. I'm not much of a soldier. I was drafted before the war, but they drafted me 6 months ago anyway. They need all the men they can get, you know? Let's hope we get home safe and sound. Not knowing how to explain my shameful behavior, I blamed it on the Russians. It's all those pigs' fault. It's all their fault. The events of this evening did not leave my mind. Both the partisan and his execution kept me awake. The poor old man stood before me, not knowing what to think, whether he was dealing with a crazy fanatic or a secret agent. Yes, he said cautiously. They make us sweat, that's for sure. It's best to leave them alone. They won't have the Bolsheviks for long anyway. And anyway, it's none of our business. And Stalingrad. We must help the Sixth Army. My uncle's fighting there. They must be having a hard time. That's true. That's true. They don't tell us everything. It won't be easy to finish off Zhukov. Zhukov will retreat, just like at Kharkov and Zhytomyr. General von Paulus is not the first time to turn him into flight. The old man was silent. We knew little about what was happening on the front line, so there was not much to talk about. At that time I could not imagine that the troops near Stalingrad were blockaded and the soldiers of the Sixth Army, leaving the last hope, fighting not for life but for death. The stars glittered in the sky. In the moonlight I could make out the face of a student watch, the memory of my graduation gleaming on my wrist. Time seemed to stop. 2 hours stretched longer than 2 centuries. We could barely walk. With each step, our boots sank completely into the snow. The wind had stopped, but the frost, growing stronger by the minute, drove us on. That night we froze like that for 2 hours at a time. Between each guardhouse I managed to get some sleep. The first rays of the sun, which I caught shoveling snow, fell on my face, distorted with fatigue. As dawn broke, the frost grew still more intense. The woolen gloves we had been given had long since burst, and we put a second pair of socks on our stiffened fingers. But it was impossible to warm up even by shoveling snow. We slapped our thighs and stomped our feet to disperse the blood. The captain ordered coffee to be made for us, almost boiling water. This was just as well, for we had only a portion of frozen cheese for breakfast. The corporal in charge of the field kitchen reported that his thermometer showed 24 degrees below zero. I do not remember how long our journey lasted. All the following days remain in my memory as a frosty nightmare. The temperature fluctuated between 15 and 25 degrees. One day the wind blew so hard that, despite the officer's orders, we left our shovels and took shelter in the trucks. That day the temperature dropped even lower, and I was sure I was going to die. We couldn't get warm. We even urinated on our stiffened hands to keep warm and disinfect the cracks in our fingers. 4 of our squad, seriously ill with pneumonia and bronchitis, lay moaning in folding beds in one of the trucks. There were only 2 doctors in the company, but they could do little to help. In addition to these severe cases, 40 men had frostbite. Some soldiers developed blisters on their noses and chapped their faces and hands from the cold. I was not too badly hurt, but as soon as I moved my fingers, blood started to ooze out. At times the pain was so severe that I became desperate and began to weep uncontrollably. But everybody had enough to worry about, and nobody paid any attention to me. Twice in the truck, where there was a field kitchen, and at the same time a medical station, I washed my hands with 90% alcohol solution. The pain was so intense that I could not keep from screaming, but for a few minutes my hands felt warm. To other troubles, bad nutrition was added. The distance from Minsk to Kiev, where we made our first stop, was 250 miles. Considering the problems that beset us along the way, we were given 5 days' rations. In fact, we should have been given 8 days' rations, and so we ate the emergency supply as well. In addition, 38 trucks broke down, and we had to destroy them along with the cargo so that they would not fall into the hands of the partisans. 2 seriously ill men died, and several soldiers had their arms or legs amputated. 3 days before arriving in Kiev, we crossed the former Russian defense line. For several hours we drove through an area filled with the skeletons of burned tanks, trucks, cannons and airplanes. The whole field was strewn with them as far as the eye could see. Crosses and pillars said that here was also a cemetery of Russian and German soldiers who had fallen in battle. In fact, more Russians died than Germans, but the soldiers of the Reich were buried singly if possible, and each Orthodox cross marked a mass grave in which lay 10 or 12 Russian soldiers. This whole picture did not add to our vigour. In addition, we had to fill the craters formed by the bursts of bombs and grenades. Finally, our convoy arrived in Kiev. This beautiful town was not badly damaged. The Red Army was trying to stop the Wehrmacht troops outside the town, in the area through which we had travelled. When the Soviet troops realized they could no longer resist the German pressure, they withdrew to another part of the city, not wanting the same thing to happen to Kiev as to Minsk. In Kiev, we made our first stop on our way from Minsk to Kharkov. It was still at least 600 miles to our final destination of Stalingrad. Kiev was an important strategic centre, where the regrouping of units coming from Poland and Romania was carried out and their preparation for the offensive in the direction of the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea. The city was swarming with soldiers and military vehicles. There were even more of them than in Minsk, but there was an atmosphere of constant readiness for battle. Our company entered the city and stopped waiting for orders from the commandant's office. Again, we walked through the snow-covered streets, slippery and tamped down like a ski track. We already hoped that our troubles were over. Everyone was waiting for the order to be transferred to new apartments. The first thing we were sent to the sanitary pass, and for good reason. It was so cold that it was impossible to wash even a little. All of us were covered with dirt and parasites. Those who received severe wounds were hospitalized, but only 7 people fell into this category. The rest of us continued on our way. We spent only a few hours in Kiev. Coming out of the sanitary pass, organized surprisingly well, the company lined up on the snowy ground in front of the building. The Hauptmann drove up on a Volkswagen and, without getting out of the car, made a short speak. Soldiers? Germans. Troops of the convoy. In this hour, when the conquests of the Reich are spread over a vast territory, it is on you that the fate of our homeland depends. On your devotion depends the victory of the German arms. You are responsible for ensuring that ammunition reaches our troops, fighting on the fronts as soon as possible. Now is the time to fulfill your duties on a front you know very well, a road fraught with 1,000 difficulties, and the factories where our workers are struggling to produce the weapons needed by the front to your support units. Their transportation must be such that no German soldier suffers from a lack of arms, food or uniforms. The country is working at full strength so that the troops at the front will get everything they need and keep their faith in victory. We must not be broken by any difficulties. No one has the right to doubt the heroism which every day is confirmed by our new victories. We all have to suffer, but together we can succeed. Do not forget that the country gives you everything, and in return expects from you total sacrifice. And no complaints because you are Germans. Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! We answered in unison. Hauptmann cleared his throat and continued in a less theatrical tone. Your company will join the 124th in 125th companies on the outskirts of the city, on the highway leading to Kharkov. Then you will move accompanied by motorized troops from the Panzer Division. They will protect the convoy from partisans who will try to delay your advance. As you can see, the Reich is doing everything to make your task easier. He saluted, and his vehicle immediately took off. We joined the companies indicated by the Hauptmann at the appointed place, and together formed the 19th Company under the command of Commander Oltrina. I hoped to meet some friends from boot camp, unless of course they'd have been transferred somewhere else or killed. I didn't know if they had left Minsk before us or if they would be travelling later. In fact, it turned out that the old company had been reformed. We now had a camp kitchen at our disposal, where they cooked hot meals. This was very important. Just before we left, we were well fed. A hot shower and a change of uniforms in Kiev finally lifted our spirits. It warmed up to 4 degrees below zero. I found Gals without difficulty. His ridiculous gesticulation was visible from afar. Well, what do you think of the weather, young man? What about the hot food? After all, we haven't had anything hot for 10 days. On that damn train, we thought we'd starve to death. You rode the train. Well, if it wasn't luck. Luck? You should have been there when the locomotive exploded. The steam was about 400 feet high. 4 guys died, 7 others were injured. Morvan got hit while we were cleaning up. It went on for 5 days. I was with a patrol, looking for guerrillas. We caught one. The peasant he robbed gave him up, and then he invited us to his house and gave us a good meal. I briefly told him of my adventures. We met Lenson and Olenshim. With the joy of seeing each other again, we put our arms around each other's shoulders and danced with shouts and laughter. The elders looked at us with surprise, not understanding what there was to be happy about. "Where is Farstein?" I asked. Lenson growled, still laughing. He's hurt his knee, an abscess so bad that he can't take his boots off, and he's waiting for the swelling to go down. Well, he's taking full advantage of the situation, said Gales. If I behaved like that every time I twisted my leg. Our conversation was interrupted by the departure signal. We returned to our posts, knowing that my friends were close by and that only a few trucks separated us. My spirits lifted, and I almost forgot that we were getting closer to the front every minute. It seemed so far away. We were driving on broken roads covered with snow and ice. On both sides they were bordered by hills of snow formed after clearing. In the gaps between them we could see ruined and burned villages and broken equipment. For dozens of kilometres we simply crawled. The troops of von Wicks, Guderian, von Reckenow, and von Stolpnagel had recaptured this territory after weeks of intense fighting. Between Kiev and Kharkov, several 100,000 prisoners of war had been taken. The amount of Soviet ammunition buried under the snow was staggering, and how could they still hold on after that? From the warming started new snowfalls, and we again had to take up shovels. Fortunately, 2 days later, an armoured escort column joined the convoy. We attached 4 or 5 trucks to the rear of the tank, and they, with engines running, slowly made their way through the snow and ice. Soon, however, the low clouds disappeared. A pale blue sky appeared. The thermometer went down sharply, and we were gripped by frost. Sometimes German pilots flew over us. We waved to them with all our might, and they shook the wings of airplanes, slowly flew by squadrons of Junkers 52s, heading east. The hot lunches no longer kept us warm. My hands were getting stiff again. Fortunately, this time we had a doctor in our convoy. We lined up at his truck at every rest stop. He coated my hands with an ointment that protected my palms from the cold. I strove to keep it on my hands and kept them in the deep pockets of my overcoat. Only as a last resort did I carefully reach my hands out, but in such a way as to retain the ointment. I spent long hours in the cabin of a multi-ton Renault, which was tumbling from bump to bump. From time to time we were removing snow accumulated below or pulling out another stuck car. In general, we tried not to go outside. So far I managed to avoid the night guard. When the darkness made it impossible to go any further, we stopped. The driver would stay in the driver's seat, and I would sleep on the floor with my feet between the pedals and my nose pressed against the engine, which emitted a disgusting smell of burned oil. We woke up half alive from the cold. Long before dawn, we would start the frozen engines. Gals visited me several times, but the driver said there were too many of us for the tiny cabin. He advised me to visit a friend myself, but there I received the same reception. A word in the open air was out of the question. One day, shortly after we had passed a large town near which there was a Luftwaffe airfield, we were joined by a reconnaissance plane, which made radio contact with the commander of the armed detachment that was escorting us. A minute later, the plane left the convoy and headed north. Following it, scattering snow with their tracks, the tanks disappeared. We continued on our way without much concern. A few hours later we heard the distant sounds of explosions. For a moment everything was quiet. Then again we heard explosions, and again silence. At 11 o'clock the convoy halted in a village covered with snow. The sun was shining, its bright light reflected on the snow, which almost made our eyes sick. The frost was severe but bearable. We approached 2 field kitchens, from which smoke was wafting. The first to arrive, the cook offered to take out the wokes. He was not bad at all. He cooked in such a way that no one had any complaints. The only oddity of his cooking was that he flavoured all his dishes with the same thick flour sauce. I joined Gals and Lenson. We headed toward the trucks, carrying steaming pots of food. Suddenly the air was torn by the sound of close bursts. We stopped for a moment and listened. Everyone else seemed to freeze too, listening to what was happening. The explosions came again. Without realizing it, we quickened our steps. "What is it?" Lenson asked an old soldier who was climbing into the truck. "Hands, boys. We're getting closer," he said. We guessed that without him, but we needed confirmation. "Yeah," said Gals. "I'm going to go get my gun." Personally, I didn't take it all that seriously. There were more explosions. There was a signal. We went back to the trucks, and soon the convoy was on its way. An hour later, when we got to the top of the hill, the guns were firing somewhere very close. Each burst literally shook the air. The drivers began to brake hard, the trucks skidding. I opened the door. Behind at high speed was a Volkswagen. Through the open door of the car, the lieutenant shouted, "Go on, don't stop. And you, help this idiot pull the car out." He drove it into the ditch. I jumped out of the cab and joined the group of soldiers who were trying to pull the Opel Blitz onto the road. The shooting started again. It seemed to be firing very close by, somewhere to the north. Slowly, with great difficulty, the Opel got out of the snow and the convoy set off again. We drove through forested mountainous terrain. The muffled sounds of explosions were still heard. Suddenly the trucks that were leading the convoy stopped again. Soldiers jumped out of the trucks and ran to the head of the convoy. What happened there? The lieutenant who had been riding in the Volkswagen not so long ago also ran forward, picking up soldiers along the way. Grabbing our Mausers, we ran with all our legs and soon reached the beginning of the column. The big truck of the group commander, as if on purpose, crashed into a snowdrift at the edge of the road. In front of the partisans, shouted Fieldfell. "They are hiding." He pointed to the left. Not too sure what was going on. I followed the sergeant who, at the head of our group of 15 soldiers, rushed down the snowy slope. As I came up, I saw several dark figures moving at right angles to us. The Russians seemed to be moving as slowly as we were. The frost and heavy overcoats prevented us from turning everything that was happening into some sort of Western or American war movie. From the cold, everything seemed to freeze: joy, sadness, courage and fear. With my head down, like the others, I moved forward, thinking more about not getting stuck in the snow than about meeting the enemy. The partisans were still too far away to see them properly. I thought, they must be moving with long strides like us so as not to drown in the snowdrifts. "Dig your own trenches," ordered the field felon, lowering his voice as if the enemy could hear us. I had no shovel with me, but I dug a small hole with the handle of my rifle. In this precarious shelter I was able to observe the enemy. The number of guerrillas who appeared from the opposite forest amazed me. How many of them there were? In the forest, through the branches of the trees, which stood leafless in winter, numerous figures were discernible. They looked like ants wading through the tall grass from north to south. Since we were travelling from east to west, I couldn't figure out what they were up to. Could they be trying to surround us? Our troops had set up a powerful battery on the nearest slope about 20 yards away. I didn't understand why there hadn't been a firefight yet. The enemy began to cross the road that lay 200 meters away from us, and the sound of large-caliber guns coming from the north became louder, and directly opposite us, the fire seemed to be answered with fire. The cold was taking its toll. My hands and feet were stiff. I did not understand what was happening, but I remained perfectly calm. A detachment of Russians crossed the road without disturbing us. They outnumbered us 3 or even 4 to 1. Our convoy consisted of 100 trucks, 100 armed chauffeurs, and 60 escorts whose only task was to protect the cargo. Accompanying the convoy were 10 officers and field officers, a doctor and his 2 assistants. Each explosion produced clouds of powder-soaked snow. Clouds of smoke were rising from the tree-covered hill. A machine gun on my right started to speak but soon fell silent. Instead of burrowing deeper into the trench, I stuck my head out like a fool. The figures of the partisans were shrouded in white clouds. Shots crackled, and the Russians returned the favor. Machine gun bursts were now coming from different directions. Soldiers everywhere were firing Mausers. The dark figures of the Russians were moving in shifts. Some of them fell and remained lying motionless. The sun was still shining brightly. It seemed as if everything that was happening was completely frivolous. Here and there bullets whistled in the air. The noise made me deaf. I reacted slowly to everything that was happening, and that's why I had never fired a single shot so far. Someone's scream sounded from the right. The firing hardly stopped. The guerrillas ran from all feet to their hiding places. Continuously firing tanks were approaching them. A few bullets hit the snow right in front of me. I fired indiscriminately like the others. 7 or 8 more tanks appeared. They attacked the guerrillas. The whole action went on for about 20 minutes. I used up about a dozen rounds of ammunition. After a while, our tanks and armoured cars returned. 3 of them were carrying prisoners in groups of 15. All of them did not look their best. 3 German soldiers, assisted by their comrades, climbed out of the trucks. One of them seemed to be almost unconscious. The faces of the other 2 were distorted by a painful grimace. In the back of one of the tanks lay 3 wounded Russians and 2 Germans. One of them was making moaning noises. At a short distance, leaning against a snowdrift, a German soldier with a blood-stained face was giving us some signs. "The road is clear," the officer announced. "You can go." We helped to send the wounded to the field hospital. I went back to the Renault. Lenson passed by, shaking his head. "Did you see?" he asked. "Yes. Do you know if anyone was killed?" "Sure." The convoy set off again. The thought of death made me uneasy. I was afraid all at once. The sun had faded, the frost was unbearable. On both sides of the road lay bodies in long brown overcoats. One of them, as we passed, began to gesture. I poked the driver in the side. "There's a wounded man, he's waving at us." "Poor guy. I hope his men are taking care of him. It's always hard in war. You never know, maybe tomorrow it'll be our turn." "Yes, but we have a doctor. Maybe there's something he can do to help him." "That's easy for you to say. We got 2 truckloads of wounded, so the doctor's got his hands full. Don't take it so hard, that's my advice. You're going to see a lot more than that." "I've seen enough already." "So have I," he said. "I've seen my knee. Shrapnel blew my kneecap off. Thought they'd send me home. They put me in the driver's unit, along with old men, boys, and the infirm. It's a big deal. The wound hurts like hell, and you have to wait hours for morphine." He began to tell about his participation in the battles in Poland. At that time he was in the 6th Army, which was now fighting near Stalingrad. It was getting dark. The convoy and its escort stopped at a large hut. Snowfall and bumps made it impossible for the surgeon to perform operations on the moves. 2 Russians had died of blood loss, and the others had been waiting for help for hours. I was about to open the door and run to the field kitchen when the chauffeur stopped me. "Don't be in too much of a hurry, unless, of course, you want to spend the night on guard duty. Here the sergeant doesn't keep a record like in the barracks. He takes the first soldiers he sees, gives them an assignment, and that's it." That's how it turned out. Soon I had to listen to the complaints of hungry gulls. What bad luck. I was put on guard duty again that night. God only knows what will happen to us. It's getting colder. We can't take it. Once again it was a clear night. The thermometer showed 22 degrees below zero. I thanked the chauffeur. We went to the field kitchen, intending to have a hearty dinner. Seeing us, the cook could not refrain from making a sarcastic remark. "What, are you hungry?" He had already removed the cauldrons from the fire and replaced them with large pots of boiling water. "Eat, but hurry up," said the cook, dipping a ladle into our cauldrons. The surgeon ordered to make him some boiling water. "He's busy with the wounded." We didn't even take off our mittens, scooping porridge with spoons. The lieutenant showed up. "Is the water ready?" "Yes, just right, Lieutenant. It's already boiling." "Good." The lieutenant's eyes turned to us. "You two, take the water to the doctor." He pointed to the lighted door of one of the huts. We covered the wokes, in which some of the porridge remained uneaten, and strapped them on our belts. I was careful not to spill boiling water on my feet, took 1 pot and headed for the improvised operating room. The only advantage of this hut was that it was warm. It had been a long time since anyone had felt at home. The doctor had set up a dressing room in a large room. G was attending to a poor man sprawled on a table in the middle. 2 soldiers held the patient, who twitched in pain. Everywhere, on benches, on the floor, on chests, lay or sat the wounded. They were being tended to by 2 assistant healers. Bloody bandages were lying on the floor. In a pot of hot water, 2 Russian women were washing surgical instruments. The lighting in the room left much to be desired. Near the operating table, the doctor placed a large kerosene lamp of a peasant, and the owner himself held another lamp over the surgeon's head. Another lamp each was held by a lieutenant and a sergeant. In a corner of the room, formed by a large stove, a young Russian was crying. He looked to be about 17 years old, like me. I placed the pot before the doctor, who dipped a thick lump of absorbent cotton into it, and stood still, unable to take my eyes off the wound the doctor was attending to. The near skin around it seemed to be torn, all soaked with blood. Scarlet blood flowed from the huge hole, over which the doctor was using some kind of scissors with bent ends. My head swam and I felt nauseous, but I couldn't look away. The patient jerked his head from side to side. 2 soldiers were holding him tightly. Blood from his face, sweat streaming down his face. There was a bandage in his mouth. It must have been stuffed in the wounded man's mouth to keep him from screaming. It was a soldier from the armoured column. I couldn't move. Hold his leg, the doctor said softly to me. I hesitated, then took hold of his leg with trembling hands and felt my arms shaking. Careful, the doctor muttered. I saw the scalpel go even deeper into the wound, felt the muscles in my leg tense and relax again. Then I closed my eyes. I heard the sounds from the surgical instruments and the heavy breathing of the patient, who wouldn't stop twitching despite the local anesthesia. Then I heard the sound of a saw. A few minutes later, the leg I was holding became heavier. It was now held up only by my hands. The surgeon had just amputated it. For a few moments I remained in this strange position, holding the exorbitant burden, and was ready to faint. Finally laid it down on a pile of bandages behind the table. Never, even if I am destined to live 100 years, I will not forget this leg. My chauffeur managed to get away, and I waited until I was no longer noticed to vanish as well. But unfortunately, the opportunity never came until late at night. I had to assist in other operations, which were no better than amputations. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when I finally opened the double doors of the hut. A frosty wind had come in. The cold seemed especially unbearable. I hesitated, but at the thought of going back to the wounded, the dead, and the rivers of blood, I decided that frost was better. The sky was clear, bright, the air seemed to freeze. The shadows of houses and trucks stood out in bright glints of snow. Not a soul was in sight. I set off around the village looking for my Reno. That way you could wipe out the whole convoy before anyone realized. The door of the hut opened and a wrapped figure emerged from it. It was visible when a Mauser flashed. The figure took a few uncertain steps through the snowdrifts. Noticing me, the man in the overcoat some in. It's my turn. Nastin Terin. Maybe you have to warm up. Unless, of course, you want to make another lap. Hey, but I'm not on guard duty. I was helping the surgeon, and now I'm going to bed. I see. I thought you were A, he said a name. You said you could warm up in here? Yeah, come on in. This is guard headquarters. We rotate every 15 to 20 minutes. You won't get much sleep, but at least you won't be cold for 2 hours straight. Yeah. Thanks. I'll come in. I pushed open the heavy door and walked in. There was a fire burning in the hearth. 4 soldiers were roasting potatoes and other vegetables in the ashes. There was no other light besides the fire. Right behind me another soldier came in, probably the guard they thought I heated what was left in the cauldron, ate without appetite, and stretched out on the floor in front of the hearth to sleep in the best possible conditions. Every 15 or 20 minutes, the guard woke some poor fellow who had just fallen into slumber. The cries of the discontented woke me up from time to time. It was still dark when the hoist was signalled. We rose slowly from the floor that had served as our bed. It had been a long time since we had had to wake up without feeling cold. A young Russian woman came to us from behind the curtains in the corner of the room. She had a jug in her hands, which she held out to us with a smile. Just hot milk. For a second I worried if it was poisoned, but Gales, who preferred to die on a full stomach, grabbed the pot and took a good gulp. We passed the milk around, then Gales grinned, gave it to the Russian and kissed her on both cheeks. She blushed. We bowed and left. As soon as we stepped outside, it was as if we were under a cold shower. Roll call began. Everyone got a cup of coffee. Like any other morning, it took us a good half hour to fire up the engines. Long before dawn, the 19th Company set off on the glistening ice of the Soviet-damned 3rd International Highway. Several times I was given way to convoys headed for the rear. We stopped for breakfast in a village. Here we learned that we were no more than 35 kilometers from Kharkov, and we would arrive at our destination in 2 or 3 hours. We tried to imagine what barracks awaited us in Kharkov. What do you think will be there? Lenson asked. The driver with whom I rode with throughout the trip was not too excited. Hey, I hope we won't be there too long, he said. Otherwise they might send us to the Volga. That's like them. It's better to go back than to go east. If no one wants to go east, we'll never get rid of the Russians, said someone. That's right, said another voice. If I were you, I'd keep my mouth shut and not trumpet my fears, added a third. About half an hour later we were back on the highway. Fog covered the horizon, and the frost was getting worse. We drove for about an hour. I covered my eyes and almost fell asleep. The movement of the truck made my head spin from side to side. I tried to get comfortable. leaning against the door. Before closing his eyes, he looked around at the snowy surroundings. The sky was covered in grey clouds. It seemed to be coming over the ground. From the side of a nearby hill, 2 black dots were approaching us, probably patrol planes. I closed my eyes. A few seconds passed, and then there was an engine noise above us, followed by a machine gun burst. Something hit the windshield. I felt a hard blow to my head. There was such a rumble that it was like the end of the world. Our Renault almost hit the car ahead of us, which stopped abruptly. Dazed, I opened the car door and climbed out. The truck behind me was upside down, its wheels spinning in the air. Nothing else was visible but flames and smoke. Quick, take cover. Across the snow, as far as the eye could see, soldiers were running. Ashensville South, they're shooting at the trucks, someone shouted. I took cover behind a huge snowdrift. There, shouted the sergeant, who ran as fast as he could along the side of the road. The soldiers, who had taken cover in the snow, pointed their pistols skyward. My Mauser was still in the Renault. I rushed to the truck, but I heard the roar of the airplane again, and I fell headlong into the snow. A hurricane had passed over me and explosions were heard nearby. Looking out of my hiding place, I saw 2 airplanes hiding behind the distant birch forests. Volkswagen captain, overcoming the bumps, carried past the convoy. The soldiers were running in complete disorder. I got up. The Air Force had struck the explosives truck. It exploded and the trucks in front and behind it were blown up. 60 meters away, everything was covered in soot. All that was left of the trucks was a solid black mass of stinking smoke. Out of the cloud of smoke appeared a field officer and a soldier. They were pulling out a bloody and blackened body. Without thinking, we rushed to help. The smoke covered my eyes, and I tried to distinguish the silhouettes of people. Someone passed by, coughing and shouting. Peasants, don't stand like a stumbling block. It's too dangerous here. The ammunition is about to explode. The smoke screen was cut through by the light of the headlights. Along the side of the road came a truck, followed by another, then 2. The convoy continued on its way. Despite the fire, I felt that I was freezing. I decided to go back to the cabin of the Renault, where at least it was more or less warm. The smoke gradually cleared and the road became visible. I saw a group of soldiers wrapped in overcoats gathered in front of an officer. "You 2, come here quickly," shouted the lieutenant. We ran up. You, the officer addressed me. "Where's your gun?" "There, Lieutenant, behind you, in the Renault." My voice trembled with fear. The lieutenant was furious. He must have thought I'd lost my gun and made up this story to hide the truth. He rushed toward me, resembling a rabid sheepdog at that moment. "Get out of formation," shouted the lieutenant. "Attention!" I stepped forward and had just taken up my visor when I felt a powerful blow. Although I ducked, my hat fell to the snow, revealing my dirty, uncombed hair. I waited for the next blow. "On guard until further notice," the officer muttered, shifting his angry grey eyes from me to the sergeant, who saluted. "You're just a bastard," the officer continued. "While your comrades in arms are dying to protect you, you didn't even notice that we were about to be hit by 2 planes. You should have seen them." I must have fallen asleep. "I'm sending all of you to the front, in a penalty battalion. 3 trucks destroyed, 7 dead, 2 wounded. They must have dozed off too. This is what you've done. You're not worthy of the weapon you carry. I will report your behavior." He went on without saluting. "So, to your posts," shouted the sergeant, trying to imitate his superior's tone. We ran in different directions. I rushed for my hat, but the sergeant grabbed me by the shoulder. "Go back to your post." "My hat, Sergeant." The soldier who was standing where my hat was lying handed it to me. At a loss, I climbed into the truck. The driver was just starting the engine. "Wipe your nose," he said. "Yeah, looks like I'm paying for the others." "Don't worry. Today we will arrive in Kharkov. Maybe there will be nothing to guard there." After the shock I'd experienced, I was out of my mind with anger. He should have noticed the planes himself. Or is he not in the convoy? Why didn't you tell him that? I thought of the 2 little dots I'd noticed in my half-sleep. There was some truth in what the lieutenant said, but we didn't expect anything like that. After all, we hadn't faced any real military danger, suffering only from sleep deprivation, frost, the endless road, and disgusting mud that was even hard to imagine. We were so cold that we did not wash our faces during the day's stops, and water was almost impossible to find. The peasants didn't seem to understand what we needed and looked at us with surprise. All this took time, and we had time only in the evening, after dark. And then we could only think of getting a good night's sleep. But all these excuses would not bring back the lives of my comrades. The mere thought that if the 3 trucks had swapped places, and we would have been the casualties, horrified me. I'd never been injured, but I knew all too well the pain of hell. Now I kept my eyes on the windshield. If they came back, I wouldn't miss them. The driver looked at me with his eternal grin. Better keep an eye on the rearview mirror too, in case they come from behind. He was clearly mocking me. You think I'm an idiot. What else is there to do? He shrugged. The expression on the chauffeur's face didn't change. You know, there's nothing you can do. When I broke my knee, I thought about my head. It would have been better to go the other way. And that's it, and leave our comrades who are fighting at the front. The chauffeur looked at me, the smile fell off his face. But soon his face smoothed out, and he said in the same carefree tone, all they had to do was to obey me. Turn round. He was clearly mimicking the field fable. You don't know what you're saying. That's all the Bolsheviks need. It's impossible. The war isn't over yet. You can't say that. The driver looked at me carefully. You're too young. Do you think I'm serious? No, I don't. You have to go as fast as you can and even faster. As if to emphasize the point, he pressed the gas pedal. I'm the one who's too young. I hate it when you say that. As if only soldiers your age are any good. Aren't I wearing the same uniform as you? I couldn't believe the words I said so passionately. Well, if you don't like it, take another cab. The driver was now openly mocking me. Clearly, he doesn't want to take me seriously. I decided not to say anything. I felt anger and sadness at the same time. First they hit you for an oversight, then they laugh. Our trucks were still travelling on ice and snow. Night was approaching, and as darkness fell, the frost intensified. The thought that our journey was coming to an end comforted me. In half an hour we would be in the suburbs of Kharkov. I wonder what condition the city is in. Kharkov was the last major city before the front. Stalingrad was separated from it by 400 kilometers. Subconsciously, despite the fact that the Soviet neighborhoods made me sick, I wanted to get to the front as soon as possible. And then there was a deafening explosion. I remember that we were coming down the mountain. A truck slowed down in front of us, stopped. Well, what else is there? I'd already opened the door. Yes, close it. It's cold enough as it is. But I slammed the door in front of the driver's face and walked on the ice that covered the highway named after the 3rd International. A car braked in front of me, passing a little more by inertia. A courier from Kharkov had brought the order. In the low light, I could see the officers quickly saying something to each other. They were trying to make a plan, discussing the news. The captain was reading the paper. A little more time passed. Then a sergeant walked the length of the convoy, signalling the muster. The captain came up to us, followed by 2 lieutenants and 3 field officers. Stand at attention. Attention, the field sergeant shouted. We stood up properly. The captain gave us a long look. Then slowly, without removing his gloves, he held the paper up to eye level. Soldiers, he said, I have hard news for you. News that will sadden you and all those who fight on the Axis side for our people and our destiny. Wherever this news is received, it will be received with deep sorrow. Everywhere on the boundless expanse of our front, in our homeland itself, we cannot contain our feelings. Attention. The field sergeant wouldn't stop. Stalingrad has fallen, continued the captain. The 6th Army under Marshal von Paulus was forced to accept unconditional surrender. We did not know what to say. After a little silence, the captain continued. In the penultimate report to the Führer, Marshal von Paulus said that awards the cross for bravery to each of his soldiers. The Marshal also writes that the suffering of the soldiers cannot even be imagined, that after the hellish battle that lasted several months, no one more deserves the glory of victory. I have before me a message transmitted over short waves from the destroyed tractor factory Red October. The High Command requires me to read it to you. It was sent by one of the last remaining men of the 6th Army, Heinrich Stoder. In this message, Heinrich says that the sounds of battle can still be heard in the southwest of Stalingrad. There are 7 of us. We are the last ones left alive here. 4 are wounded. We've been hiding in a dilapidated factory for 4 days. I haven't had a crumb in my mouth. I printed the last magazine for my machine gun. In 10 minutes the Bolsheviks will be done with us. Tell my father that I have done my duty, that I know how to die. Long live Germany. Hail Hitler. Heinrich Stoder was the son of Adolf Stoder, a Munich physician. There was silence, broken only by gusts of wind. I thought about the fact that my uncle had also fought at Stalingrad. I had never met him because the 2 branches of our family had been torn apart. I had only seen his picture and knew that he wrote poetry. I felt as if I had lost a friend. Some soldier cried. His greying temples gave him an aged look. Then he stopped standing tensely and walked toward the officers. "My sons are dead," he shouted. "I knew this would happen. It's all your fault, you officers. It's all useless. We can't stand the Russian winter." He bent 3 times. "2 of my sons died there, my poor children." "No, calm down. We heard at the field, Fabel." "No way. Kill me if you want. It doesn't matter now. Nothing matters now." 2 soldiers came out and seized the unfortunate man under his arms to drag him away, for he had just insulted the officers. But he resisted as if he were possessed by demons. "Take him to the doctor," said the captain. "Have him sedated." I thought he might add something else, but the expression on the officer's face didn't change. Maybe he'd lost a relative too. Midge quietly. In small groups, in silence, we walked back to the trucks. It was completely dark. Cold bluish-grey spots appeared on the white horizon line. I shivered. "It's getting colder," I said to the soldier who was walking beside me. "Yes," he answered without looking away. For the first time I was so impressed by the vast expanse of Russia. I clearly felt the grey horizon shrinking around us. 3/4 of an hour later we were already in the ruined suburbs of Kharkov. The weak light of the headlights did not allow us to see everything properly, but everything that was in the beam of light was destroyed. The next day, after spending another night on the floor of the Renault, I was able to see for myself the chaos of the ruined Kharkov, a city that, despite its devastation, was of such great importance. In 1941, 1942 and 1943, our army had taken Kharkov several times. The city was recaptured by the Russians, then taken again by the Germans, and finally it remained with the Bolsheviks forever. At the moment in question, our troops captured it for the first time. The city resembled a burned-out skeleton. On the ruined roadsides there were mangled cars and guns, collected by the troops to clear the roads. The mass of mangled metal was further evidence of how hard the battle had been fought here. The plight of the soldiers was easy to imagine, buried under the snow. The steel corpses were a sign of a certain phase of the war. The Wehrmacht positioned itself in some, more or less, surviving areas of the city. The sanitary service, located in a large building, gave us a chance to wash up. After washing off the dirt, we found ourselves in the basement of the building in rooms filled with various beds. We were advised to try to sleep, and despite the bad time, it was noon, we all drifted off to sleep. We were awakened by a sergeant who took us to the mess hall. Here I found Gales, Lenson and Ollensheim. We talked about the fall of Stalingrad. Gales insisted that it was impossible. No 6th Army. Jesus Christ, there's no way the Russians could defeat them. But you heard the bulletin. They were surrounded, they had no weapons left. What could they do? They were forced to surrender. "Then we should try to rescue them," said someone. "It's useless," said an older soldier. "It's all over now." Shit, shit, shit. Gals clenched his fists. "I can't believe it." For some of us, the fall of Stalingrad was a painful blow. For others, the event aroused a desire for revenge that raised morale. Among us, given the difference in age, there was no consensus. The older ones were in a defeatist mood, while the younger ones were determined to free their comrades in arms. We were on our way to the barracks when an altercation arose in which I was mostly to blame. The guy with the shattered knee, the driver of the damned Renault, bumped into me. "You happy?" he said. "I think we're going back tomorrow." There was irony written all over his face. I felt myself blush with anger. "That's enough," I shouted. "We are retreating, and it's your fault, and my uncle died in Stalingrad." He turned pale. Who told you that he died? And if he didn't die, it's even worse." I kept shouting, "You're just a coward. Did not you tell me? It is better to leave them to their fate." My travelling companion couldn't come to his senses. He looked around. Then he grabbed me by the collar. "Shut up," he ordered, swinging. I kicked him in the shin. He was about to hit me back when Gales intercepted his arm. "That's enough," he said calmly. "Stop it, or you'll end up in the shoe." That's it. Another guy who likes what's going to happen to him. My opponent couldn't help his anger. "I'll show you, all of you." "Miss, stop it," Gultz insisted. "Nursey off. Fuck you." He didn't have time to say anything else. Gautz's fist came down on his chin. He bent and fell to the snow. Lenson had just arrived. "Oh, damned underdogs," shouted the driver. He tried to get up and rejoin the fight. The stocky, sturdily built Lenson struck him in the face with the toe of his shoe, shod with metal, before he could get up. The chauffeur screamed in pain and fell to the snow, putting his hands to his bloody face. We did not continue the fight and returned to our own, breathing heavily and swearing. The soldiers standing nearby looked at us grimly, and two of them helped the driver to his feet. He was still yelling something. "We'll have to keep an eye on him," warned Giles, "in case he shoots us in the back when we attack." The next day's rising was later than usual. When we went to the company roll call, a gust of wind mixed with snow hit us in the face. To protect ourselves from the snow gusts, we raised our collars, and then we heard the good news. Felfel-Leus, who we had not seen for ages, was standing in front of us, holding a piece of paper in both hands. He, too, was stirred by the wind. "Soldiers," he read, taking advantage of the gap between the two gusts. "The High Command, realizing the condition you are in, is giving you a day's leave. Nevertheless, given the complexity of the situation, at any minute may come the order to collect. So report to the barracks every 2 hours. Needless to say, you won't have time for girlfriends or visiting family," he added with a chuckle. "But at least you'll have time to write to them." Leia sent 2 soldiers to collect and distribute the mail. They sent me 4 letters and a parcel. We wanted to see Kharkov, but the weather drove us inside. All day we rested in preparation for the journey back. Therefore, when the next day we were informed that we would be bringing food and weapons to a unit in the area of military operations somewhere south of Voronezh, we did not take the news with enthusiasm. "Come on," said Giles. "What difference does it make what kind of snow we get stuck in, whether it's near Kiev or Voronezh?" "Exactly," said Olin Scheim cautiously. "But Voronezh is already the front." "Yes, I know," said Gales. "All the same, someday we'll get to the front." I did not know what to think. What's happening on the battlefields? I was both curious and afraid.